This is the printing press is invented and gets perfected in the middle of the 1400s, and then I like the dark, it just fits. And so by this time period, the 15 and 1600s is when they're starting to really develop the printing press. Good afternoon. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and share my research with you. History is not only what I do, but it's something I am passionate about. Many of the roots of that passion are here in the history department at Middle Georgia State, where I graduated with my bachelor's degree in history in 2011. 6 years later, I stand before you as a third-year PhD student at Georgia State University. I have a few more gray hairs than I'd like to admit, but apart from that, the education I received here from my outgoing and brilliant professors at the history department, they just deserve eternal gratitude, and so I had to take a second and thank them. One of those here. So thank you for being my professor. And so let's get started. Now, my research focuses on early modern English religion and folklore, specifically the intellectual origins of the witchcraft narrative during the period. Before we get started, since we're talking about witches today, I want to make sure I differentiate witch hunts that took place in early modern Europe and modern concepts of witchcraft. Today's lecture deals with thousands of Europeans that were tried and executed for witchcraft in the 16th and 17th centuries. Most of these men and women were innocent victims who confessed under extreme duress and torture. We will not touch on modern interpretations of witchcraft as a religion or witchcraft as a practice. Instead, I'm going to explore ideologies behind witch hunts and trials. These ideas heavily influenced early modern society, and many of these stereotypes created during this period survived and still exist in some form. Those cultural origins are the basis for my discussion today. So, this afternoon, in connection with MGA's Night Fest, I'm going to talk about the witchcraft phenomenon in early modern Europe, specifically the outbreaks in England and Scotland during the period. Now, when I say early modern, I'm speaking about a period between roughly 1400 and 1800, but it is important to note that time periods are not barriers. Many historians continue to debate how to appropriately define time. So let's think of the early modern more as a complicated and varied set of events, transformations, and mentalities occurring within a period. So in an interview, A Song of Ice and Fire author George R.R. Martin discussed some of his inspirations for the politically tumultuous and deadly world of Westeros. One being England's War of the Roses. So these wars took place between 1455 and 1485. The wars were essentially fought between two rival noble families, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Those wars were extremely vicious, they were bloody and rife with families divided. Murder was relegated to no one, even children counted among the victims. So how many of you are familiar with the mystery of the princes in the tower? These two children, they were heirs to the English throne, and they were put in the tower for their safety, and then they disappeared, and no one ever saw them again. And that took place during this period. So this is the kind of mentality we're talking about. I think it was their uncle that had them arrested or protected. So the saga ended on August 22nd, 1485 with the Battle of Bosworth Field, when Henry Tudor defeated and killed Richard III, seizing the throne of England as Henry VII. A century later, Henry's granddaughter Elizabeth I rules England, and the son of her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, ruled Scotland as James VI. This period is the period where witch prosecutions start to pick up. So that's a little bit of background. Now, in 1597, King James VI of Scotland publishes a comprehensive treatise on the existence, dangers, and deserved punishment of witchcraft titled Daemonologie. The book defined what a witch was, how the witch received her powers, and the ways witches use their powers to wreak havoc by killing livestock, destroying personal property, and attacking their neighbors. The Scottish king lived in a world where witches and malefic magic appeared in popular ballads, they were depicted in plays, and they lurked upon the pages of published pamphlets. The people who lived in early modern England and Scotland encountered characters like Shakespeare's Weird Sisters in Macbeth and Edward in King Lear, who either practiced sorcery or pretended bewitchment and madness. The ominous threat of witchcraft was everywhere. So, what was a witch in early modern Europe? What are the origins of characters like the Weird Sisters or even today's Melisandre? Nearly a decade before the publication of Daemonologie, James VI experienced the threat of Malfred witchcraft firsthand. In a pamphlet entitled News from Scotland, author James Carmichael recounted a 1591 incident of Scottish witchcraft and conspiracy that involved the king, his wife Anne of Denmark, and 11 accused witches. In the pamphlet, there are quite a few witches named, but I'm going to name a few of them. How many of you are Outlander fans? Okay. One of those witches was named Gillis Duncan. There's one named if you're an Outlander fan, she's somebody who gets tried as a witch in Outlander. So, you know. Agnes Sampson and Dr. Fian, all of these confessed under torture to practicing witchcraft and attempting to bewitch and murder the king. Now, to define a witch, we've got to let go of all our 21st century logic and reason as not to dismiss what may sound fantastical to modern ears. Then understand the 16th and 17th century mindset. The threat of witches was real. Even in the early modern period when witchcraft was a felony punishable by death, what defined a witch was in no way uniform or static. Witch prosecutions occurred all over Europe and were conducted by diverse groups. German witch hunts differed from Italian versions, and Protestant prosecutions differed from Catholic trials. What is more, English witch prosecutions proved to be particularly unique, and thus the English definitions of what a witch was contained its own specific characteristics. As I mentioned before, King James VI of Scotland published his treatise on witchcraft entitled Daemonologie in 1597. I'm going to be referencing this work heavily due to its major influence on English notions of witchcraft and prosecution. This text is instrumental in our understanding of how the English define witchcraft, but James' main focus is on the demonically bound witch. It is important to note that by the turn of the 17th century, English law and church authority deemed any manner of magical charm for good or bad purposes as demonic witchcraft. And this is despite popular sentiment, which actually threatened long-standing folk practices in England. Charms using hair, tails, blood, or incantations were considered heretical and connected directly to the worship and service of the devil. The men and women described as witches obtained their supernatural ability via a contract with Satan. According to Daemonologie, Satan approached the potential witch in the form of an animal. These creatures, often called familiars, came in the form of dogs, cats, apes, elves, moles, cows, goats, and a number of other manifestations. My personal favorite, and I have to tell you about him because he's important to me, I found him in a 1647 pamphlet entitled A Discovery of Witches, and it's by the Witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins. And the familiar was called Vinegar Tom, that was his name, and he was described as a hybrid creature with the body of a dog and the head of a bull. I had a bag made with his picture on it, and that's completely normal. I carry it around to all my classes, and my students get a kick out of it.
It's absolutely.
Now, the contract between the devil and witch often included physical commitments as well, which came in the form of an oath written in the witch's blood or the witch's mark. Pamphlets describe the mark as a teat or a large spot on the witch's body where the animal familiar drinks the witch's blood. Contracts, oaths, and other symbolic forms of allegiance to the devil appear within witchcraft pamphlets of the period, and often prosecutors searched for physical witches' marks to prove an accused witch's guilt in court. And this is important, and we'll come back to that. Now, in exchange for their souls, witches developed the ability to perform several types of magic. According to texts on witchcraft from the period, including Daemonologie, the witch possessed the power to affect herself and others. Furthermore, following the establishment of services to the devil, a witch obtained the ability to heal the sick, cause illness and death in her enemies, the ability to control emotions, to move objects, and use spirits to possess or torment people and places, and raise storms and tempests. So, what did a witch look like? I mean, this is what we call that woodcut, like I talked about earlier, from the period. And we've got some traditional ideas of what a witch looked like even here. So you've got the pointy hat. They're flying on a broom. And this becomes like our popular idea of what witches looks like. So did she have a pointed hat, a broom, a black cauldron, or a frightening appearance? The short answer is not really. Accused witches did not all fall into one stereotypical category. While the higher percentage of accused witches were women, both men and women faced accusations and execution for witchcraft. There were also no set boundaries provided by age. Even children faced prison and execution for the crime of witchcraft. Now, for example, during the infamous 1692 outbreak of witchcraft in Salem, Massachusetts, the youngest accused witch imprisoned was only 2 years old. Those accused of witchcraft often lived in poverty and relied on their communities to survive. Many cases included social outcasts, widows, and marginalized people. But the wealthy and affluent also faced suspicion and prosecution. A witch could be anyone: family, neighbors, friends, and foes. The threat weighed down on a society that daily lived on the edge of chaos and destruction. Illness, natural disaster, poverty, bad harvests, any sort of misfortune pointed to evil origins. And witchcraft often appeared as the most logical answer to life's ills. And according to historians like Eamon Duffy, traditional religion, feast days, festivals, and ritual behaviors remained prominent throughout towns and villages in the country. The clash between traditional folk practices and the attempt to create uniform religious observance directly affected the witchcraft phenomenon. English laws against witchcraft describe traditional practices such as some forms of healing and even remnants of Catholic ritual observance as malefic witchcraft. And when I say malefic, that is another word for like sinister, evil, devious, it's bad. So that being said, according to pamphlets on witchcraft, including Daemonologie, the most significant danger witches posed to the population at large was the threat of Satan and eternal damnation. Witchcraft pamphlets warned against the looming influence of the devil. These accounts taught lessons. They warned against the dangers of sin and impiety. They cautioned the population at large against the growing threat that only faith, prayer, and a militant detection and eradication could stop. The witch was dangerous because she served as an earthly servant to the greatest enemy of all Christians. What is more, a witch posed a danger to her community because as Satan's agent, she could hurt enemies, destroy lives, and condemn others. According to King James's Daemonologie, the main reason why men and women risked the eternal damnation of their souls by practicing witchcraft were revenge, curiosity, and greed. And I'm sure those are three things none of us have ever considered because we are completely pious. So these are real human frailties that everyone is weak to. And yet these are like your three main causes for becoming a witch. In 1566, a Chelmsford account accused witch Elizabeth Francis. She resorted to witchcraft because of a desire for wealth. In return for her devotion, a white cat provided Francis with 18 sheep that made her wealthy, just to let you know. While greed and desire for worldly goods motivated witches like Francis, revenge often served as a very palpable motive. The same Elizabeth Francis, she was very busy, sought to harm neighbor Andrew Biles after he failed to propose marriage to her. First, she destroyed his property and his goods. Next, because that was not enough, Francis confessed to bewitching Biles himself, which led to serious illness and eventually his death. In 1674, accused witch Anne Foster bewitched her neighbor Joseph Whedon by mutilating 30 of his sheep and burning his farms after Whedon refused to sell her mutton at the price she wanted. Accused witch Margaret Flower, angry over the loss of her job, retaliated against her former employee by bewitching his son, Lord Henry Ross, to death in 1635. But, although a witch posed a substantial threat to the lives and property of her neighbors, they also threatened the immortal souls of the community. And this was actually stressed a lot more than earthly problems like dying or your sheep getting destroyed. Now, as I stated earlier, despite comprehensive legal and clerical efforts to push religious uniformity and standardize religion, folk traditions persisted. Peasants used charms to detect treasure and thieves. They knew folk remedies to heal the sick and performed rituals to detect witches and unwitch victims. But they considered those practices to be examples of good magic and did not associate it with the malefic magic of demonic witches who traded their souls for power granted by Satan. Unfortunately for them, the witchcraft laws established under Elizabeth and James did not acknowledge a difference between good and bad magic. And according to Daemonologie, all magic, regardless of intentions, came from the devil and thus was evil. In turn, anyone practicing or using magic willingly and knowingly risked their eternal souls. This included mothers who consulted healers for charms to save an ailing child, and young girls who sought out the local wise man or woman to inquire about who they would marry. All of these people were at risk. But any offenses that caused harm or death resulted in a sentence of execution. Also, if you got caught more than once, so if you did something small the first time and you had your year sentence and you stood on the pillory and you were like, I'm sorry. If you got caught a second time, that was it. You got executed that second time. Now, while laws under Elizabeth provided some lenience for lesser crimes, the Witchcraft Act under James did not. The 1604 Act Against Conjuration, Witchcraft, and Dealing with Evil and Wicked Spirits deemed most acts of witchcraft punishable by death, and the use of familiar spirits was added in, meaning that the most accused witches found to have communicated with a familiar spirit forfeited their lives on the first offense. So the looming threat posed by witches led to a set methodology used to detect their work and reveal guilt. According to Daemonologie, apart from confession and torture, 2 methods existed for detecting witches. They're up here. First, an outside party would conduct a physical examination of the accused witch in search of a witch's mark, and that's what we talked about earlier. By the 17th century, most witchcraft accounts included official physical searches of accused witches as part of the basic protocol. In the case of Elizabeth Sawyer, women appointed by the local justice of the peace in Tottenham, Master Arthur Robinson, searched her and reportedly found a blue and red teat the size of a half finger on Sawyer's body. In another case, Isabel Gowdy confessed to a covenant with the devil, which entailed the creation of a mark on Gowdy's shoulder where Satan sucked her blood. The detection and reporting of a witch's mark provided important evidence against the accused witch in court. That being said, the judge and jury in an English witch trial took the word of a court-appointed examiner on the presence of said mark. Physical examinations rarely took place during the trial. And let me explain that, because this is an interesting thing that I think is important to know how these people were trying to execute it. So this looks like an examination that's in a court, and that is not how it would happen in England. Usually a judge or the justice of the peace would assign someone in the village to go and inspect the accused witch in a private place, and then come back to court and report on whether or not she found a mark. And if that witch denied that, well, that was it. It doesn't matter, because they're not going to expose her flesh in the court. The judge, who is a male, and the jurors, who are male, that's a taboo thing. We're not looking at her body. So we're going to take the word of the woman that we appointed, who's usually an upstanding member of the community, who might later be accused of witchcraft. So that is one method. The second method mentioned, often in accounts of witch prosecutions and in James' Daemonologie, involved the process called the fleeting on the water, or witch dunking. And I don't know if you could tell, but they've got a woman hoisted up over the river with their little contraption, and she's tied up, and I'll explain to you what that means. So, while not as prevalent in witchcraft accounts as the witch's mark, the water test was used occasionally, and James actually said that this was the best method to use. For example, a 1612 Northamptonshire case featured Arthur Bill. He was accused of bewitching cattle and murdering a neighbor. Bill and his parents underwent the water test. In the water test, an accused witch is bound with his or her feet and hands tied together. Next, the bound witch is thrown into a body of water. If the accused witch floats, their guilt is proven. They take them out of the water, and then they execute them. Now, if the accused witch sank, they most likely drowned, but they were acquitted of all charges, and their immortal souls were saved. Arthur Bill and his family floated and were thusly executed in 1612. Now, in a pamphlet from 1647, our self-proclaimed witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins mentioned the water test and described the reason and how it worked. So what I'm going to do is read to you what Hopkins said for context, and then I'll explain it because it has some interesting language. This is Hopkins. King James in his Daemonologie saith, "It is a certain rule that for saith he, witches deny their baptism when they covenant with the devil. Water being the sole element thereof, and therefore saith he, when they be heaved into the water refuseth to receive them into her bosom. They being such miscreants to deny their baptism, and suffers them to float, as the froth on the sea, which in this water will not receive, but cast it upon and down, until it comes to the earthly element on the shore, and there leaves it to consume." So what Hopkins is saying is that in the process of making a pact with the devil, as a witch, the witch denounces his or her baptism, and thus the water rejects them. And this is why they float. So there is actual logic behind it, somewhat. So Briefly, I mentioned torture and confession. Both are really important to the story to some extent because they help to explain the unique nature of English witch hunts. According to English law, torture was illegal, which meant the disallowment of using devices like the pillywinks, which was this little bitty wooden device that you would put on the prisoner's fingers, and you would tighten it, and it would crush their fingers. And then they were also disallowed from using the rack, which is a device that stretches your body until your bones break. I will preface that both of these things were used, but they were illegal. And a lot of times they were used by the Royal Court Authority when they were interrogating for treason and not really for this. A lot of times you see these devices used in Scotland and not in England. That being said, torture did not include locking up a prisoner for days without food or water or depriving those prisoners of sleep. That was acceptable. So many witches confessed to their crimes following weeks of isolation, intense interrogation, and sleep and food deprivation. English laws also further complicated the witch hunts in ways that did not occur on the European continent. In England, accused witches were entitled to a trial by jury, which lessened the success rate of convictions without solid evidence or confession. And that is where your dunking comes in, that's where your witches' marks comes in, and intense interrogation to get confession. In comparison, witch hunt outbreaks in Spain, Italy, and Germany resulted in much higher execution rates compared to England, where singular accounts of witchcraft were more common and large outbreaks proved rare. Because the much higher burden of proof, accused witches stood a better chance of survival as long as they held out and didn't confess. So I'm going to close out by going back a bit to literature. Around 1606, William Shakespeare introduced the world to three ominous sisters who in a few brief scenes manifested on stage the many stereotypes I've mentioned here today. Scholars of Macbeth believe that King James viewed performances of the play at court, and connections are obvious because of the ways the characters behave within the play and because there's a Scottish background to the plot. The Weird Sisters, though familiars and the destruction of livestock, dancing in storms, and supernatural predictions, they all mimic behaviors of the North Barrick witches who stood accused before James in 1591. The stage echoed popular sentiment of the time, a mirror of the world the playwrights lived in. Those stories survived, as did the stereotypes within them. George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones character Melisandre often behaves in similar ways to Elizabeth Sawyer, Isabel Galley, and Agnes Sampson. While her deity, the Lord of the Light, is not characterized as this sort of Satan-type character, she has used demonic light magic to maim and murder. She's performed magic on corpses and predicted the future. In the 6th season of the television series, which has outpaced and differs from the books, she even appears as an old and deformed crone, similar to the marginalized women often accused of witchcraft in early modern England. They're not like super academic either, so they're easy to read. All right. Yes, ma'am.
There's a documentary Witches Simply Murder.
That's it. Is that the blonde lady with the curly hair?
I don't know.
I'll look it up.
I think that's it.
They set it up like it's going to continue, but they've never added another.
They've done 2 episodes and it just breaks off. But it does talk about James and it talks about Matthew Hopkins. And anytime they talk about Matthew Hopkins, I get like excited because I'm like, look.
Wouldn't Hopkins where he would go into a village and it'd be like 2/3 of the village is gone by the time he leaves?
He was not a popular man by the end of it.
Yeah, I'm talking about like whole villages would get decimated because he'd go in there and just declare everybody witches.
The most, I think the most he ever got was like 20 people. But yeah, I mean, that's
Yeah, it was bad.
a lot.
It was bad, yeah.
He
Because that's
They
in
use
those
the project
villages.
original.
That's one village.
I might
he
have,
was a weird guy.
I might have gotten
It's
to
probably the
Yeah.
original
I
content though.
mean, how many people were in the
His,
village? You know, a couple hundred maybe?
His pamphlet
Yeah,
though,
40 of them?
you can find it at like I know I have access to academic databases, but a lot of times archive.org has some of these pamphlets, and so you could read Mr. Hopkins' little. It's like 12 pages, I want to say.